This panel session this afternoon is, the title is Reflecting on the Referendum, and we particularly wanted to try to get, this morning we've had a lot of people who were, head and shoulders involved in the running and delivering and planning and strategizing and the winning of the referendum. The panel for this afternoon, people have had varying degrees of involvement, but we've basically have two academics and two journalists, and it really is to get a sort of an outsider looking in view. And people have done different work on this, they've written different pieces, or they have different perspectives, and I think it will be very useful to hear the different perspectives. Can I, first of all, just give apologies. As you know, on the programme, Andrew Hyland, who's the co-director of Marriage Equality and indeed was the comms director for Yes Equality, I'm afraid Andrew's father died late last week, and he's obviously not in a position to be here today. So just on your behalf, obviously, to send the school's condolences to himself and his sister Lisa, in fact, who was they were two stalwarts in the Yes Equality HQ. So I'm sitting in for him, just so that you know. So, as I say, this session I think has a really interesting lineup, and what I'd like to do is, rather than taking the time now doing massive introductions, I'm just going to introduce the speakers one after the other, and then hopefully we can have some time for conversation and discussion. So I'm going to call first of all on Dr. Jane Suter from DCU. Jane is the, are you okay with that?
Sure.
Great. Jane is the Director of the Institute for Future Media and Journalism and is also a Senior Lecturer at Dublin City University, a member of the ECPR Standing Group on Democratic Innovations, and of course she formerly worked as the Economics Editor with the Irish Times. She's going to explore a number of issues looking at the legacy of the campaign, but also some of her own academic work looking at some elements of the campaign, which I think will be really useful to share both with those who are here from Ireland and with the international audience. So Jane, I'll ask you to, if you'd like to step up.
Okay, so yeah, hi. I'm very impressed you're all here and not sunning yourselves on Killiney Beach. So as Grania said, she's asked me to explore the legacy of the campaign and reflections on it, as well as its kind of effectiveness in communication terms. So myself and some other colleagues from other universities in Ireland, UCD and UCC, were part of the Political Studies Association of Ireland, Voters Parties and Election Group. So we got a little bit of funding, nowhere near enough, but to do some research into where voters actually were and why they voted as they did and that kind of thing. So just want to try to share some, I suppose, bigger picture rather than just the anecdotes. So we looked at three different factors, which should be important from both the sort of the legacy and campaign effectiveness perspectives, but may also be useful for people thinking about any upcoming campaigns on the 8th or that sort of thing. So the first thing we looked at was the impact of the Constitutional Convention, and as you know, a sort of a similar enough but different in important ways convention is just being set up now in terms of the 8th and other things. And then we also looked at the dynamics and particularly the importance of the kind of the mobilisation and knowledge, and then at the demographics. So those are the three kind of things that I just want to touch on very briefly with you, and then if you're interested in any of the different parts of it, we can chat about it at the Q&A. So I think that, as Grania said earlier, like obviously campaigners have been working on this, I think you said a decade, but it's actually several decades really, isn't it, for a lot of people, on advancing LGBT rights in Ireland. But the actual referendum was preceded by a process of deliberation involving ordinary citizens. And this is one of the first times in the world that a deliberative process was used, which resulted in a referendum, and it's the first time in the world that such a process actually resulted in a change in a vote. So it's the first to have succeeded. So I know there's a lot of people nervous about there being a convention preceding the 8th, but the experience and the research that we've done on the influence on the convention on this would suggest that, it's not that it can actually be quite a good thing. So for those that don't know, the convention was set up in 2012, and it had 66 randomly selected citizens and 33 politicians who were part of it. And they were asked to deliberate on a number of different topics, reducing the voting age and the electoral system and the representation of women, all sorts of things. But I think, without a doubt, the main one and the one that really resulted in the referendum was the deliberation on marriage equality, which the convention discussed at its third meeting. And I think what was important there was a room pretty much like this one, with people sitting in round tables, and but they were randomly selected, so they weren't, self-selected as all of you are here today. And there was the politicians, and the people who got up to address them ranged from the Knights of Columbanus. It's probably not hard to guess which side they were representing. The Catholic bishops, but then also people from Yes Equality and from other sides. And then importantly, some of the people who went on to be quite important in the campaign in terms of, children of gay couples and so on, who spoke about their own personal experience. And as a result of that deliberation, there was a big change of mind in the room. So when you went into the room, there was we surveyed people before and after the convention. When you went in, it was over 60% were in favour of equality, but on the way out at the weekend, it was 80%. So the people had been moved by the personal experiences and the evidence and the ability to talk things through at the round tables. And I think because there was such a big recommendation for it, as well as the intense media interest which surrounded the whole debate, it somewhat forced the hand of the Taoiseach. So as we all know, our Taoiseach is instinctively fairly socially conservative, and up to then he'd kind of resisted a lot of requests. The Labour Party had a promise for a referendum in its manifesto, but it didn't make it to the programme for government because Fine Gael didn't actually have that in its manifesto. And I think then importantly as well, because the convention also had politicians and representatives from all the political parties, it ensured that cross-party agreement. And I noticed in the last section, somebody was saying, that was one of the things. There wasn't actually one of the parties against it. And of course, it would have been possible for an opposition party to try to make some political capital out of this, to try to push it or raise some roadblocks. But we did research with all of the politicians who'd been part of it. And again, the evidence that came back to us was that the strong degree of consensus achieved in the convention was one of the factors that made sure that all of the parties were actually behind the move at the end. And I think as well what happened is it allowed space and time for a kind of a careful and considered debate where you could actually listen to both sides, you could debate, you could engage with it. And when you look, and I know Paddy's going to talk more about this, but when you look at, say, what happened in Brexit, where there was just random heat and noise generated, that kind of space where you can actually listen respectively, where facts that are brought can be challenged, where you can actually understand what is the truth behind things, that was really important. And so that helped policymakers in terms of, coming to the decision of where it was going to go. As well, afterwards, our research after it of the public, we found that people who are actually aware of the convention and aware that these randomly selected citizens had actually voted in favour of it, they were more inclined to be yes voters. They weren't more inclined to turn out, but they were more inclined to be yes voters. That was statistically significant. So it did actually have, or we think anyway, it suggests that it had an impact on the kind of deliberative nature of the referendum in the wider community. So we hope that that could be somewhat comforting for those thinking about a constitutional convention for other issues. But of course it depends on the quality of the information and the impartiality of the chair and, you know, who the secretary is running it and that kind of thing. If we look then at the actual campaign, so the origins in terms of, you know, the very long, decades-long campaign, and then the convention were unusual, but the conduct of the campaign itself was also unusual. So it was very, very intense, and it was a very high turnout with a very high impact media strategy and a door-to-door canvass. And Irish campaigns are known for, you know, the door-to-door, the wearing out of the shoe leather, but even by Irish campaign standards, this was a particularly intense door-to-door efforts. And so it resulted in a turnout of over 60%, which is a 20-year record in Irish referendums. And it reversed a kind of a declining turnout trend. The average trend in Irish referendums is about 52%, and the last one to break 60% was the 95 divorce referendum. So it's a long time since we got more than 60% of people to turn out for a referendum. And the last kind of one, if you divide referendums into different types, we have lots of EU ones, and then we have institutional ones, which are about changing rules, and then this kind of moral social one. And obviously, marriage equality fell into the moral social ones. So the last one of those was the children's rights in 2012, and that only had a turnout of 33.5%. So, you know, I think if we'd had 33.5%, we could have had a very different result. So, you know, the high turnout was really vital. So I think the fact that, yes, equality had so much civil society involvement, all of the political parties represented, but it was also very, very highly organised and concentrated its message on about equality for all people. And I think crucially that the messaging was targeted at the electorate and not at the base. So the campaign message wasn't aimed at LGBT groups or people who are already, you know, bought into the argument. It was targeted much more widely, and, you know, that was obviously the right thing to do, although it did cause, you know, some small issues with some people at the time. And then obviously the huge effort. So it turned out that 26% of the country were personally approached by somebody. So 1 in 4 voters were approached on the street or at their homes by members of the campaign team, and that had a really strong impact on turnout. So when the very first message was, "I'm voting yes, ask me why," and I think the group was really effective at maintaining that core message. And in our surveying, we found that a lot of people could actually recall that message, you know, which is particularly instructive. And then just the variety of means of getting to the people, of reaching, you know, personally reaching 1 in 4 voters. So that's not that you just saw somebody at the crossroads or outside a shopping centre. That's, you know, you actually spoke to a member of a campaign team. So, you know, the bus was obviously important here, you know, the novelty things like Ben & Jerry's free ice cream. But there was also like a very clear focus, sort of multi-stranded social media campaign, the strong merchandising, you see some of that, you know, with the bilingual badges, the bags, the brochures. The Phone Your Granny, which was when we found with older women, they could actually remember that. So this idea of younger people, you know, asking their mothers or their grandmothers or whatever to vote for them. That very much seemed to work, as well as the registration initiative, where I think there was 60,000 new voters added to the electoral register. So there was a very significant swelling of the register. And of course, all those people are still on the register now. So, and they were by and large yes voters. And then the social media, where the Twitter and Facebook feeds were used to remind people to cast their ballots, record their vote after they'd gone to polling. So again, this persuasion of friends and family and all the other facilitating ways of getting people to get to the vote. Whereas if we look at the no campaign side, there was a number of conservative Catholic groups involved there, but it was actually played a lower key role than it had with previous referendums. So I don't know if that's likely to be the case for the next one. So in contrast to the yes, they focused almost exclusively on the airwaves, where of course there's very strict regulation about 50-50 balance on all broadcast shows, and they paid for a lot of YouTube ads. I know, like, my kids were watching YouTube and were having to watch the first 5 seconds of them before they got on to whatever viral video they were trying to look at. And of course those fall out outside the strict rules on political advertising. And the messaging there was very much focusing on sort of traditional, children need a mother and father and that kind of thing. So they used some of the opinion poll evidence which showed that voters were concerned about some adoption and surrogacy arrangements and that kind of thing. And they became the points of contestation. But I think the Yes campaign managed to kind of very well sidestep those rather than engaging with them, even though some campaigners at the time were worried about that approach. It proved to be the correct one. But I think interesting, one of the things we looked at then was this just about marriage equality, or does it actually speak to changing shifts in the sand about the kind of the liberal conservative divide in Irish society? And there is a kind of a deep-rooted conservative liberal cleavage in Irish politics, and as we know, that's delivered some of the most divisive and bitterly contested referendums. So, divorce passed by a margin of, I think, 9,000 votes in 1995, having failed in 86, and all 3 abortion referendums were 83, 92 and 2002 were all, very unpleasant and exposed deep divisions. But we thought, we wanted to have a look into, is there sort of value changes going on in Irish society? Was there a tipping point? And it looks like it might have been those who came of age in the 1980s. So up to that point, Ireland was, as we know, overwhelmingly conservative, dominance, Catholic social teaching in Irish law. The restrictions on contraception and divorce. So up to the 1980s, we had about 2/3 of people who were firmly in the conservative cleavage, and about 1/3 liberal. And that was reflected in the 83 amendment, which passed by about 2/3, and the 86 divorce, which was defeated by about 2/3. So the question was, well, is it just that people tend to get more conservative as they get older? So you expect older people to be more conservative and to vote for the status quo? Or is it that we're actually seeing a generational shift, that so older people now are less conservative than older people were in their parents' kind of generation? So while we didn't have really proper panel data to be able to do that, what we did is kind of look in the aggregate at it and looked at in the divorce and abortion referendums in the 80s, the number of people who were then in the 18 to 30 age bracket and how they voted, and then transpose them up to now be the voters in their 40s who were voting in this referendum. And what we found is that they stayed pretty much the same. So those who voted on the Liberal side in the 80s and the 90s are still now, as they're older, voting on the Liberal side. So it's a sign that kind of conservative Ireland is dying, as opposed to, that people become more conservative as they get older. So that's been totally transformed. So there was a Liberal majority when you look at all the different demographic trends across classes, regions and genders. I think it was only older men in rural Ireland, so not a a plurality objective who voted in the main no. So it looks like there's sort of a slowly dying Conservative Ireland. And my very last point is kind of semi-self-serving, but hopefully there's some people here who might be able to do something about it. Obviously, we have a lot of referendums and so on here, but we're one of the few European countries that doesn't actually have a properly funded referendum study to be able to look at this. We were begging and borrowing from different research accounts to even get the money to do the research that we did here. And I think when we look at Brexit, we look at our own referendums. I think the idea of actually having a study where we can actually see what works, what doesn't, how different people are, would be something that could inform policy as well as assisting campaigners in devising tactics and so on. So if any of you are ever in a position to advocate for a referendum study, we'd all be very delighted. Thank you very much.